The studio buzzed with artificial excitement. Studio lights shimmered from every angle, bouncing off polished floors and carefully curated set pieces. A roaring band hit a jazzy note as the applause sign lit up in bright red. Audience members clapped on cue, not out of sincerity, but because they were told to. Behind the curtain, Karoline Leavitt stood still, back straight, eyes focused. She wasn't nervous. She was alert. There was a difference. Dressed in a navy blue blazer, the kind that made a statement without trying too hard, she took a quiet breath. Her makeup was flawless, her heels precise, but none of that mattered. She didn't come here to look good. She came ready for a fight. Backstage, a production assistant gave her the nod. The curtain drew open, cue cards were shuffled, the music played louder, and out walked Jimmy Kimmel. Tailored suit, practiced grin, years of Hollywood charm etched into every movement. The audience clapped as he waved, winked, bowed slightly, and strutted across the stage with the ease of a man who controlled the room. Thank you, everyone, he beamed, brushing one hand over the audience with faux humility. Tonight we've got someone special, a real headline maker. Some call her bold, some call her divisive, and others just call her dangerous. Let's give a very careful welcome to the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, Karoline Leavitt. The applause was confused. It came in short, polite bursts, scattered and hesitant. Some people clapped because it felt right to. Others didn't. A few leaned forward with skeptical eyes. Karoline walked out calmly, each step deliberate, each movement poised. She extended her hand. Jimmy took it, half handshake, half power move. His grin widened as their hands met. The lights hit them hard, but it was Karoline who radiated something different. Composure. Karoline, Jimmy said, settling into a seat, you've become quite the polarizing figure, haven't you? The audience chuckled awkwardly. Karoline looked at him, cool and composed. Or maybe I just say things that make the powerful uncomfortable. The crowd stirred. A few eyebrows raised. Someone let out a hmm? Jimmy gave a dry laugh, glancing down at his cue cards as if trying to reset the vibe. Touché, he muttered. Let's get into it then, shall we? They began with pleasantries. Childhood in New Hampshire, her family's small-town business, her unlikely rise from a college intern to becoming one of the most visible political communicators in the country. Jimmy kept his voice friendly, but it was theater, and Karoline could read the script behind his eyes, and so could many watching at home. The audience shifted with every line, laughing when Jimmy prompted it, nodding when he led them. But Karoline never followed his rhythm. She answered questions with measured grace. She wasn't trying to win favor. She was trying to reveal the truth behind the mask, the truth of what the media had become, of how shows like this one, under the guise of entertainment, had slowly turned into cultural battlegrounds. Jimmy leaned forward, flipping to a new card. So, some say you're combative, aggressive, that your tone's too sharp, especially for a woman in your position. Do you think that's fair? Karoline's smile barely moved. Is it aggressive, she asked softly, to call things what they are? Jimmy leaned back, arms folded. Well, I think a lot of people might say it's about delivery. Karoline nodded. Funny how delivery only matters when the speaker's not part of the status quo. Another murmur through the crowd, a few claps, a few scoffs. That was the moment everyone could feel it, the shift. The tone changed. The cameras were still rolling, but this wasn't late-night fluff anymore. This was a reckoning. Jimmy smiled wider, a reflex now, but behind it his eyes flicked to the producers. Karoline wasn't playing the game. Jimmy changed gears. The questions turned sharp. So Karoline, he began again, you once called the mainstream media, let me get this right, A virus worse than COVID. Were you being hyperbolic, or should we be worried about your bedside manner? The audience gasped, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. Karoline didn't blink. People weren't just scared of a virus. They were terrified by how the media fed that fear every single day. You know that. I know that. And millions of Americans lived it. Somewhere in the crowd, someone clapped. Others whispered. Jimmy tilted his head, half amused. Isn't that a little dramatic? Karoline's voice was calm, but cutting. Not nearly as dramatic as silencing scientists, not nearly as dramatic as social platforms banning doctors, or mothers, or veterans, all for asking the wrong questions. The tension in the studio thickened. Even the band in the corner stopped fiddling with their instruments. Jimmy shifted in his seat, visibly trying to lighten the tone. Look, this is a comedy show. We try to have some fun here. Karoline leaned forward, eyes locked. You didn't invite me to laugh, Jimmy. You invited me to sit here and smile while you try to twist my words. But I'm not going to make it easy. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to expose what you won't say out loud. Silence. The audience froze. Then, a single person clapped. Then another. Then boos. The room was splitting. Not just in opinion, but in spirit. Jimmy glanced sideways, suddenly uncomfortable. Off stage, a red light blinked. Time for a commercial soon. He knew he had to regain control. He chuckled. Okay, no need to get too heated. We're just having a conversation. Karoline didn't lean back. Are we? She looked around the audience slowly. Because conversations don't start with insults. They don't come with cue cards and applause signs. They come with respect. But that's not what this is it? This is a show, and I'm supposed to play the villain. A ripple ran through the room. The producers off stage were whispering now frantically. Jimmy tapped his cue cards nervously. Let's just move on. Why? Karoline interrupted. Her voice was calm, even, but unyielding. Because it's getting uncomfortable. Because you're losing control. Jimmy laughed stiffly, trying to recover. I'm not losing control. I just think people came here to be entertained. Karoline sat up straighter. Then maybe they tuned into the wrong episode. Because tonight they're going to get the truth. Her words dropped like a hammer. Jimmy's face tensed. His voice tightened. Karoline, I get it. You have a message. But don't you think there's a better way to deliver it than turning this into a lecture? Karoline met his stare. I think Americans are tired of polite lies and tired of being told to sit down, shut up, and smile. They don't want another entertainer pretending to be a gatekeeper. They want someone, anyone, willing to say what needs to be said. The crowd was on edge now. Murmurs, applause, pushback. It wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a confrontation. Jimmy looked down, then back up. You don't think this kind of tone just creates more division? Karoline exhaled through her nose. Truth doesn't divide us, Jimmy. Lies do. And right now, this entire setup, it's a lie. The audience held its breath, and at that moment, right then, it was clear. Karoline hadn't come to play along. She'd come to confront an entire system right on its own stage. And Jimmy Kimmel, master of controlled television and safe mockery, was realizing. He'd invited a lion into the den, and the lion wasn't backing down. There's a saying in broadcasting, control the crowd, and you control the story. But in that moment, Jimmy Kimmel had lost both. He tried to soften his tone, shuffle back into safe territory. He laughed unconvincingly and raised a new cue card like it was a shield. Okay, let's shift gears, he chuckled nervously. I want to talk about that tweet of yours, where you said the press acts like scorekeepers instead of truth tellers. Kinda rich, isn't it? I mean, don't you work for the guy who made the media a blood sport? He paused, waiting for laughs. But the laugh track didn't come. Karoline didn't flinch. She looked straight into the camera, not at Jimmy. "We didn't start the game," she said, "but we're done pretending it's not rigged." And just like that, the room broke open. One half of the audience erupted into thunderous applause. The other half jeered, booing, hissing under their breath. People weren't just watching a late-night show anymore. They were watching a rupture in real time. A man in the front row, gray-haired with a Vietnam vet hat, stood and clapped slowly. Beside him, a younger woman, maybe early 30s, shook her head and muttered "fascist" under her breath. A fire had been lit, and the oxygen in the room was now a debate. Jimmy shifted in his chair, trying to ride the moment like a practiced host. He waved a hand, half joking. "All right, folks, let's not burn the place down. Let's keep it civil." But Karoline wasn't playing polite anymore. She leaned forward, her tone clear and resolute. "I came here because millions of Americans have been silenced, mocked, labeled, shoved to the sidelines of their own country. And tonight, I won't let that happen again." A new round of clapping started from a group of older audience members seated together in row 5. Retirees in church clothes, their hands steady, their expressions proud. A woman, maybe 70, clutching a small American flag in her lap, called out softly, "Let her speak." Jimmy heard it too, and it rattled him. He smiled tightly, looked into the camera, and gestured toward the offstage crew. "Okay, we'll be right back after this short break." But before he could finish, Karoline's voice cut through him like a blade. "No," she said, "you're not cutting away now. Not while I'm finally being heard." The audience gasped. The crew backstage froze. One of the cameramen instinctively zoomed in on Karoline's face. Jimmy lowered his hand from his ear, where his producer was whispering furiously in the earpiece. The message was clear. This was no longer a controlled segment. This was a live confrontation, a reckoning. Karoline turned toward the audience now, not to Jimmy, but to the people. To every senior at home who's been told their values are outdated, to every Christian mocked for their faith, to every veteran who fought for a country they no longer recognize, this is your moment too. Because if they can shut me down on live television, they can do it to anyone. Silence fell over the crowd. One man wiped his eyes. A young intern off stage leaned into the producer and whispered, "She's flipping the room." Jimmy stood up slightly, unsure if he should stay seated or take back the floor, but it was too late. Karoline had flipped the table, and America was watching. The music returned briefly after the commercial, but it was different this time. No upbeat melody, no smiles, no scripted chuckles from Jimmy's sidekicks. The room was stiff, tense, like a courtroom holding its breath before the verdict. Karoline sat upright, back straight, hands folded on her lap. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't softening. She was ready for part 2. Jimmy inhaled deeply and tried again. "Well, free speech is important. No one's arguing that. But don't you think your tone might actually be doing more harm than good? I mean, the way you speak, it divides people." Karoline stood, not slowly, not aggressively, just firmly. "My tone?" she repeated, her voice rising only slightly, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Would you say that to a man, Jimmy? Or is a strong woman speaking truth just too much for Hollywood to handle?" The crowd erupted again. "Let her speak," someone shouted. It came from the left side of the theater. Elderly, confident. Others booed in response. It was no longer a debate. It was a battlefield. Jimmy raised his voice, losing his grip. "All right, enough. This is a show, not a courtroom." Karoline didn't blink. She stepped forward, just one step, and that was enough. This is exactly the courtroom people like me get dragged into every single day. Not because we lied, not because we shouted, but because we told the truth, and we didn't use your script. Off stage, producers waved their arms. Security began shifting in the wings. Jimmy was signaling to cut the segment. He turned back toward Karoline and hissed under his breath, "You're hijacking this." Karoline turned to him, and only him. "No, Jimmy, I'm ending the game." Her voice trembled, but not from fear, from fire. The American people, they see what's happening. They're not dumb. They know this isn't about fairness. It's about control. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. A man in the back of the audience, salt and pepper hair, strong New England accent, shouted, "She's right." Karoline turned toward him. "Thank you, sir." Then to Jimmy again. "You just proved my point." Security began to move toward the stage. The room was in chaos, divided not by violence, but by truth. Some stood and applauded. Others crossed their arms. And Jimmy? He tried to regain control. "We're done here," he snapped. "This segment is over." But it wasn't, because the moment was no longer his. It belonged to Karoline, and to every person watching who had ever felt unheard, unseen, or unwelcome in their own country. Karoline squared her shoulders. "You can shut off the lights, Jimmy. You can cut the mics, but you can't stop what's already begun." Her words weren't just directed at him anymore. They were for every screen, every home, every living room across America. And somewhere, in a quiet living room in Iowa, an elderly couple held hands. A veteran in Florida stood and saluted the TV. And in that studio, on that stage, the show may have ended. But the truth, it had just begun. And now, the studio lights dimmed. But they couldn't erase what had just happened. The cameras cut. The network hastily pushed to commercial. The house band awkwardly struck up a tune to fill the silence. But silence didn't return. Not in that room. And not across America. Karoline Leavitt stood tall, her expression calm, even as two production staffers and a security officer approached. One whispered something to her. She didn't flinch. She simply turned, without anger, without fear, and walked off stage on her own terms. She was not escorted like a criminal. She exited like a soldier returning from battle. Jimmy Kimmel stood under the remaining spotlight, unmoving, visibly shaken. His signature smirk was gone. He glanced off camera to the control room, unsure of what to say. There were no more jokes left. And for once, Jimmy Kimmel had no punchline. Then, within minutes, the confrontation was posted to social media, first by a live audience member using a shaky iPhone angle, then by a conservative news blogger who clipped the moment Karoline refused to be silenced, then by America. Let Her Speak exploded on X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, Rumble, and Truth Social. "Did you see what Karoline just said to Kimmel? She stood her ground. That's what courage looks like. No screaming, no swearing, just facts and fire." Veterans shared it with tears in their eyes. Pastors sent it to their congregations before Sunday sermon. Grandmothers reposted it with a single line. "I remember when women were told to sit down." Not anymore. A 72-year-old Army widow named Joanne M. from Michigan went viral for writing, "I buried my husband with a flag on his casket. He fought for this country, for free speech, for the right to disagree." Karoline just did that on live TV, and they couldn't handle it. Comments flooded in. "She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She just stood up for us." That was bravery, in heels, on enemy turf. Hollywood got exposed tonight, and the mask slipped. By sunrise, every major outlet had been forced to cover it. Even those who didn't agree with her had to admit something big had happened. Jimmy's team scrambled. By morning, they released a cold, two-line statement. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live took an unexpected turn. We strive to provide a balanced forum and regret that the discussion became tense. But the American people weren't buying it. The clip had already surpassed 60 million views across platforms in under 24 hours. Why? Because it wasn't just about Karoline anymore. It was about every single person who had ever been told they couldn't speak their mind without being labeled, called dangerous for asking questions, mocked, dismissed, or censored for believing in something bigger than themselves. 3 days later, Karoline stood at a podium in a sun-drenched town square in New Hampshire. Behind her stood veterans, nurses, teachers, pastors, teenagers with signs that read, "Truth has no off switch." She looked rested, confident, but most of all, fired up. She wasn't playing defense. She was delivering a message. "What happened on that stage was never about me," she began. "It was about every American who's been told to sit down, stay quiet, and play nice. While their faith is mocked, their families are ridiculed, and their freedoms slowly eroded." The crowd was silent, listening. She paused, then delivered the line that would lead every news report that night. "If you stand firm, if you speak truth, the world might try to kick you off stage, but they'll never be able to take away your voice." The applause was thunderous. A man with a Korean War veteran cap wiped his face with a handkerchief. A mother in the front row hugged her son tighter. A group of young conservatives from a local college stood with their hands over their hearts. Karoline continued, "I wasn't angry that night. I was resolute, because I knew I wasn't alone. I knew millions of you were watching, not just me, but yourselves, being dismissed by a system that's forgotten who it's supposed to serve. So to everyone watching who's ever felt silenced, know this: they may own the cameras, they may hold the mic, but you hold the truth. And truth doesn't need permission." The crowd stood, cheering, weeping. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, a very different scene played out. Behind closed doors, Jimmy's team held an emergency strategy meeting. Ratings for the episode had spiked, but the backlash was brutal. Emails flooded the network. Sponsors pulled ad spots. A petition demanding a public apology surpassed 1 million signatures in 48 hours. Kimmel himself remained silent, his usual Twitter wit replaced by total radio silence. But no amount of editing could change what America had already seen. A woman calmly refusing to be mocked, a host scrambling for control, and the truth rising to the surface. In churches, barbershops, diners, and veteran halls, the conversation had shifted. A moment that was supposed to be late-night entertainment had become something else, a cultural earthquake, a call to courage, for the elderly who remembered real censorship in the 60s, for middle-aged parents watching their kids be silenced on campuses, for young Americans wondering if truth still had a place on television. The message was clear. It's not about left or right anymore. It's about right and wrong. And for once, someone didn't flinch. In the weeks that followed, Karoline Leavitt's clip became a case study in courage. It played at civic clubs, at military retiree breakfasts, at youth conferences and prayer groups. People didn't just watch it, they felt it. And they remembered it. Because Karoline wasn't escorted off stage because she was rude or wrong or disruptive. She was escorted off stage because she refused to surrender her voice, and in doing so, she gave it to all of us. Do you believe in freedom of speech, even when it's uncomfortable? Should a talk show host have the power to silence someone in front of millions? Should one voice be allowed to rewrite the truth? Comment your thoughts below. Your voice matters. Share this video if you believe truth should never be muted. And if you stand with Karoline, with the Constitution, with faith, with courage, subscribe now. Because the more they try to silence us, the louder we will become.